Andrew Cunanan's spree killing ended like most do, with his own death. Generally, spree killers either commit suicide or are killed by police, and in this case was no different.
Having examined the police work that led investigators to Cunanan, Dr. Stone assesses the murderer.
Like most spree killers, Andrew Cunanan was out of control, consumed with rage and driven by rejection. His need for attention, something clear already from a young age, seemed to have contributed to his need to gun down a celebrity. For his crimes, I placed Cunanan at level 15, psychopathic, cold-blooded spree or multiple murderer.
Spree killers have been on the American landscape for at least a half-century. One of the first terrorized the public nearly 40 years before Andrew Cunanan. The case presented investigators with challenges they had rarely encountered before. Lincoln, Nebraska, 1958. 3 bodies were found in the back garden of a small suburban home. 57-year-old Marion Bartlett, his wife Velda, and their 2-year-old daughter Betty Jean had been shot and beaten to death. 14-year-old Carol Fugate, Velda's daughter and Marion's stepdaughter, had vanished, along with her 19-year-old boyfriend, Charles Starkweather. The next morning, August Myers, a 70-year-old acquaintance of Starkweather's, was found shot in his home. Police wondered if Starkweather could be on a killing spree. They looked into his past. As a child, Charles Starkweather had been teased mercilessly by his peers for being bow-legged and nearsighted. He became an outcast, and his isolation spawned violent thoughts. He left school when he was 15 years old and began working as a rubbish collector. But at the age of 18, he fell in love with Carol Ann Fugate, a rebellious, blue-eyed teenager who accepted him as he was. He made up his mind to marry her, but Carol's parents forbade it. In a rage, Starkweather murdered Carol's family. Police immediately suspected him, but assumed the violence would stop there. Then they discovered August Myers' body. John Cameron retraces the police investigation into Starkweather's killing spree.
Starkweather got out of the car and walked up and shot Meyer immediately. He then dragged Meyer into the wash house and covered him with a blanket. Starkweather then went through the house and took some guns. Charles Starkweather fits the prototype of a rampage killer. He spent his whole life being mocked and teased, and he wanted to even a score with a society that shunned him.
Starkweather and Fugate fled. They hitched a ride with unlucky passers-by Bob Jensen and Carol King. From the back seat, Starkweather put a gun to Jensen's head.
He may have been paranoid that they knew about Carol Fugate's family being murdered, but I think Starkweather was just enjoying the power of his violence.
Starkweather ordered Jensen to drive back to August Myers' ranch, then forced him and King into a nearby cellar.
And he shot Bob Jensen and Carol King in the storm cellar. Then they took Bob Jensen's car back into town. Starkweather's murders were completely random. There was no pattern behind them, so police couldn't anticipate where he might strike next.
Starkweather claimed 2 more victims. Local police issued a bulletin about the car they believed Starkweather was driving.
At this stage, police are desperate. Starkweather has killed 5 complete strangers in addition to Carol's family and August Meyer. And it's clear he's enjoying it. Unless police can catch him, Starkweather is going to keep killing.
The next morning, the police finally got a break. Starkweather and Carol were stopped on the side of the dual carriageway when a state trooper stumbled upon them. Carol ran towards the deputy, claiming to be a hostage. Starkweather sped off, but police soon caught up with him. After his arrest, he said the killing spree had been fun. Both Carol Fugate and Charles Starkweather were convicted of murder. Carol was sentenced to life in prison, but was granted parole in 1976. She continues to maintain her innocence. In 1959, Charles Starkweather was executed in the electric chair.
Charles Starkweather is a psychopathic, cold-blooded, spree or multiple murderer. That, coupled with his admission of enjoying the process of taking people's lives, leads me to place him at level 15 on my scale of evil.
Understanding the criminal mind can help investigators track down a killer on the run. But sometimes, murder suspects flaunt themselves to police and the media. In these cases, detectives must be absolutely certain they have the actual murderer, not an attention seeker.
He thrives on the notoriety of being the happy-faced serial killer. He likes having his story out there because it validates him as a killer.
In most homicides, the killer tries to avoid detection, carefully concealing evidence in an effort to throw investigators off his trail. But one type of murderer does not attempt to hide their deadly acts: the attention seeker. Examining the interplay between these killers and police affords Dr. Stone valuable insights into the murderers' psyches.
Attention seekers represent a unique challenge to investigators. They announce their crimes, often confessing to murders with no interrogation or with no evidence linking them to a crime. For attention seekers, receiving credit and notoriety is the ultimate objective. It is for these reasons that even when an attention seeker claims to have committed a murder, investigators cannot be sure they have found the killer. Such is the case of the happy-faced killer Keith Jesperson.
1993, Santa Clara, California. A decomposing body was found in a ditch on the edge of a motorway. The body was that of a woman. She had been strangled. Investigators found a flashlight at the scene, but no other evidence. The case went unsolved for 13 years. 2006. Detective Ron Bruce, head of the cold case unit for the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Department, dedicated himself to learning the identities of both the victim and her murderer. But after reviewing the evidence, he was unable to develop any new leads. Then he came across a 1994 letter to a local newspaper from someone who claimed to be the killer. It contained details specific to the case, including an accurate account of the location of the body.
I put her body on or near a pile of rocks about 50 yards north of Highway 152, westbound about 20 miles from Santa Nella, which, if you threw a dart, you couldn't get any closer than that.
The letter had been written by convicted serial killer Keith Jesperson, who was serving multiple life sentences for killing 4 people during a 5-year spree across the Pacific Northwest. During his homicidal campaign, he had sent letters to police and the media taking responsibility. They were signed with a mocking, smiley face, so Jesperson had been dubbed the Happy Face Killer. Once in prison, the convicted murderer claimed a toll far greater than the crimes for which he had been convicted.
Well, I've told the number is up to around 166 people.
Jesperson's statements were astounding. If true, they would make him one of the worst serial killers in history. His claim of a killing spree from one coast to the other could be plausible. As a lorry driver, he had regularly crisscrossed the United States. But authorities were able to eliminate Jesperson as a suspect in many of the murders he claimed to have committed. In several cases, they determined that it was unlikely he could have been present when the murder had been committed. In one instance, they learned that a fellow inmate had paid Jesperson to confess to a murder for which the inmate had been convicted.
It was fun, it was humorous at times to see the craziness of the justice system.
While Jesperson could have been responsible for other murders, he was an attention seeker, known to lie.
Notoriety is Jesperson's main motivation for his crimes. His boast of such a large number of victims would seem to lack credibility. But once someone has proven the capacity to kill, his claims must be taken seriously.
For Detective Bruce, Jesperson's confessions were problematic.
He thrives on the notoriety of being the happy-faced serial killer. He likes having his story out there because it validates him as a killer.
Attributing the anonymous strangled woman's death to the wrong perpetrator could have meant a killer remained at large. And Bruce did not want to play into Jesperson's twisted ploys for attention. As part of his investigation, the detective interviewed the convicted murderer in prison. Jesperson said he had encountered the victim at a motorway rest stop. In his version of events, she was hungry and had no money. He said he bought her food and promised to give her a ride in exchange for sex.
She's willing to have whatever it took to meal in her tummy and a roof over her head out of the rain and everything like that. Probably 3-4 minutes. This is how long a person takes to die. It isn't like on TV where 15 seconds is overdone. It's not a nice thing.
The first time I met him was at the Oregon State Prison. We go into this large interview room in this very old prison, and they brought Mr. Jesperson in. People describe me as a big guy, but he was bigger than me. Huge hands, bear-like hands, I mean just huge paws. Very personable, very cooperative. He had no hesitation in talking at all. I would not want to be a woman who angered him. That seemed to be his trigger. He picked up a lot of women. Everything was normal. He was fond of picking up prostitutes at truck stops and did it quite frequently. One of his victims, he described, she says, you know what, my life is pretty much over, I just want to die, and he laughs about it. And he goes, really? And she says, yeah, you know, I wish I was just dead. Well, I can make that happen. Oh, really? Okay. And he kills her. Whether that's true or not, I don't know.
But it is Bruce's assessment that Jesperson is telling the truth about this particular Jane Doe.
And in this particular case, he described being on the road for a long time. When he went to the rest area on I-5 with the victim, the only way I can describe it is that Mr. Jesperson would, in his mind, write a script for how this relationship was going to go. And I asked him, I said, so if a prostitute was loving and caring, would that anger you? And he goes, no. And that's what I wanted. He wanted to believe that for the time that they were with him, that they cared about him, that they loved him. And I'm just guessing, but the combination between his being extremely tired, her being, in his words, rough in how she pursued sex, it was business, it wasn't intimate, and rewriting the script, if you will, that was the trigger for him.
Bruce knew that Jesperson had already claimed credit for murders he hadn't committed. But the detective possessed one essential piece of information with which to test him. Police had discovered a flashlight at the scene. Only the killer would know of its existence.
There has to be one or two things that only the detectives know and the murderer knows that allow us to know that the person we're talking about is in fact a killer. In this case, flashlight.
Jesperson described the dumping of the victim's body.
I carried her to the boulders and tossed her down. And when I did so, the flashlight broke off of the handle and flipped somewhere. I felt for it and I couldn't find it.
With this detail confirmed, Detective Bruce felt satisfied that Jesperson's confession to the murder was legitimate. In 2006, the state of California charged Jesperson with the murder of the unknown victim.